Thanks everyone for coming today. It is tree time here at the Secret Science Club. Our speaker today, Thomas Crowther, is a global ecosystem ecologist at the Swiss Federal Institute of Technology in Zurich. And that is where I believe he is zooming in from today. In Zurich, he directs the Crowther Lab, a multidisciplinary group of scientists who research forests and the relationship to climate change. He's looking at everything from microbes and fungi in the soil to the charismatic megaplants, the trees, and creating unprecedented global maps and data sets describing the role of trees and forests in Earth's carbon cycle. His work has made headlines all over the world, and his research has been featured in the New York Times, the Washington Post, National Geographic, Rolling Stone, and on the BBC, NPR, and CNN. Last year, he received the British Ecological Society's Founders Prize, and he is scientific advisor to the United Nations Trillion Trees campaign, as well as the United Nations Decade on Ecosystem Restoration. We're so pleased Thomas Crowther can be here with us today. Please take it away, Tom.
Thank you so much for the introduction, and thanks Dorian and Margaret for introducing me to speak here. And thank you everybody also for logging on to come and hear the presentation. So yeah, we at the Crowther Lab are a group of young scientists motivated to understand and restore Earth's biodiversity and Earth's nature in the fight against biodiversity loss and climate change. And to sort of maybe kick us off with a little bit of a more motivational introduction, I'm gonna start things off with this introductory video.
Humans have always learned to overcome problems with the help of a simple process: trial and error. But unless this information learned is retained, trial and error will always reach a dead end. Networks are what enable us to process and disseminate this information. Several million years ago, our ancestors were experimenting with their own versions of trial and error. Whether this involved the food they ate or tools they used, it was the network of neurons in their brains that allowed them to learn from their endeavors and ultimately continue to evolve. Over many generations, as our communication skills improved, we grew another kind of network that facilitated learning at the community level, social networks. Fueled by our capacity to communicate, suddenly, if one person learned something, the whole group could share in that information. Now we started to develop on a new timescale. Within just a few thousand years of community-level problem solving, human population growth began to explode. Unfortunately, our rapid expansion has bred a whole new generation of problems. A series of global issues are threatening all of society, and the scary truth is that we no longer have millions of years to adapt. We have only decades. So, is it possible for humankind to overcome these global scale problems in a matter of years? We believe it is, and by drawing on the same principles we've always used. We use machine learning to perform rapid trial and error calculations that take place billions of times faster than human learning. And to process this information, we work with a vast network of thousands of ecologists from around the world. By allowing us to detect global patterns from local observations, these networks help us to understand Earth's capacity to store carbon. With these basic principles, we hope to generate a rapid ecological understanding that can inspire a global restoration movement to address the threats of biodiversity loss and climate change.
So ultimately, we all here want to do our part in this fight against climate change. Ooh, how do I get to the next slide? But we're facing something quite devastating because our atmosphere is incredibly thin, and that makes it vulnerable. It's analogous to the width of the rubber on a balloon. And every year we emit about 10 gigatons of carbon into that space. That's like analogous to that's about the mass of 27,000 Empire State Buildings every single year being emitted into the atmosphere. And it's happening year on and year out, which is gradually warming our climate, as we all know. Now, some of this goes into the land, some into the ocean, but a large chunk of it remains in the atmosphere, which is warming our planet, and it's growing constantly. So, of course, technological and societal movements to reduce these annual emissions are going to be the highest priority to prevent these annual emissions and to prevent ongoing climate change. But if we want to try to draw down some of the emissions that currently exist, we're going to need an immensely powerful system. And the most powerful system that we know of to date is this, the natural system. This is a beautiful NASA simulation showing the carbon cycle and how it changes throughout the year. And you can see the high concentrations of carbon dioxide in the high latitudes at the beginning of the year, indicated by red. But as we tick on into spring and then summer, you'll see these concentrations start to fade. And that's caused by one thing. It's the emergence of leaves on trees. This simple ecological process transforms the carbon cycle every single year, and it's one of several massive ecological fluxes that balance one another out. In a few months' time, those red colors will return as soil carbon decomposition increases in the fall. And those balanced ecological processes have been regulating our climate for thousands, hundreds of thousands of years. Now, in contrast, the human emissions are relatively small. So given the massive scale of this system, managing these ecosystems effectively has to be among one of our brightest options in the fight against climate change. But if we are all going to engage in this opportunity that we have, ultimately we need to know two things. We need to know what the scale of the potential is. If we're all going to invest our valuable time and energy in a solution like this, we need to know what is possible globally. And we also needed to know what contribution we can have as individuals and how we can get involved in this movement. And so those initial questions have been the motivation for much of what I'm going to present today. Because until very recently, our understanding of Earth's ecosystems has been very limited. And that's because we've based our understanding primarily on observations from satellites, which have fantastic global coverage. But they can't tell us what's going on below the canopy surface. And without that information, it's hard to differentiate 10 trees from one. So understanding the scale of this system has been very, very challenging. And to address this, rather than basing models purely on satellite information, we've started to take a next generation approach by connecting with with ecologists all over the world who understand their local ecosystems. So until recently, our best understanding based on these satellite observations was that there was about 400 billion trees on our planet. But with this next generation approach, we can now build new networks. And these networks of information are based on, as I mentioned, ecologists all across the globe who have stood in their local ecosystems under that canopy, counting the number of trees, identifying the species of those trees and the size of every single one of those trees, and even taking soil samples so that we can understand what's going on below. And with over 1.2 million locations, we can now get a really good picture of how these ecosystems vary across landscapes. And by pairing this information up with satellite information and using machine learning and artificial intelligence, we could extrapolate these trends all across the world to start to explore the spatial patterns and the variability in tree density across the world, where we could start to see where the dense forests are and the open canopy forests are. We could also start to see where the different species are distributed and how much carbon is stored within this massive forest system. But at the very first thing we identified is that across this enormous forest system, the Earth is home to just over 3 trillion trees. This is about 7 or 8 times larger than that previous estimate. And it really put our understanding of the scale of this system into a new context. With the knowledge that there's about 3 trillion trees on our planet, the UN rapidly transformed their billion tree campaign into the trillion tree campaign. But that information only describes where ecosystems exist right now and the state of those ecosystems under current climate change conditions. it doesn't really give us insights into where trees can naturally exist. But using exactly the same kind of models that I described, those machine learning models, we can remove the influence of humans, and that allows us to extrapolate tree density all across the entire globe. And the first thing we identify is that every global model is wrong. The first thing we could see is in several regions around the world, when we've modeled ecosystems all across the globe, is that we miss loads of local areas. So for example, here I've highlighted the Vatican City. We identified that there are 0 trees in the Vatican City, which you can see is clearly incorrect. At the same time, we estimated that there were a few trees in the Faroe Islands, which also is vastly incorrect. But what we learned is that at the very local scale, we can underestimate and we can overestimate. But when we bring all of the data together at the global scale, those overestimates and underestimates tend to balance one another out. And another thing we learn is that the more data we include in those models, the smaller and smaller and smaller those errors get, which enables us to build a new perspective, an entirely new perspective on this forest system. And through that approach, we were able to explore where trees might naturally exist in the absence of humans. And here you can see that there is vastly more room that where trees would naturally exist in the absence of human activity. We've reduced the global forest system by almost a half. There used to be about 5.8 trillion trees across the globe, which would have maintained an entirely different climate system. Now, of course, we can't restore trees across this entire system because much of this land is used for urban land or agricultural land, which we clearly need for a growing economy and a growing human population. But when we remove these ecosystems, when we remove the areas that are intensely used for human activity, we are left with this, and this is the degraded regions. These are the places where trees might naturally exist, but they no longer exist because of past human activity, even though we are not intensively using those specific locations. Now, at this point, I will include a caveat that you'll see here that most of the regions that I've identified here are yellow to green, and that suggests that they may be 10 or 20 or 30 or 40% potential for tree cover. So in most of these regions, it's not suggesting that there should be an entire canopy, full canopy of trees, but restoring some level of native tree diversity and density would bring these ecosystems back to a more healthy state. And when we did that, we could identify that across the entire globe's Earth system, that if we were to restore ecosystems across these regions, there's room for just over 1 trillion new trees. And if we could protect and preserve those ecosystems in the long run, that 1 trillion new trees might have the potential to capture up to 30% of the excess carbon that's lingering in the atmosphere right now. When we launched this information about a year and a half ago now, nothing could have prepared us for the media explosion that followed. Because this information didn't just suggest that trees are good. We've always known that trees are excellent. But now we know that along with all the other ecosystem benefits they provide, like clean water, clean air, food, medicines, and thousands of other services that are necessary for human life, they can also represent a really meaningful contribution in the fight against climate change. And so when this media explosion happened, immediately this was followed by huge commitments from governments and companies all around the world pledging their commitment to the restoration of Earth's forests. Suddenly, organizations all around the world were committing to the restoration of these ecosystems in the fight against biodiversity loss and climate change. And with the job creation that would result, the idea of this global restoration movement suddenly started becoming a reality. But in the excitement of it all, and with the entire world looking on, we realized that there were mistakes in this simple message. Because the strength of this message is in its simplicity. But that necessarily comes at the expense of nuance that is so important in science. And we realized that at this time, that many people, while most people were seeing this as an opportunity to rejuvenate Earth's biodiversity, others were seeing it as an opportunity for an easy way out, an opportunity to plant a few trees and ignore the very real and urgent challenges of cutting greenhouse gas emissions and protecting the ecosystems that still remain, which are our highest priorities in the fight against climate change. So these examples ultimately refer to the concept of greenwashing. And immediately once this media explosion happened, we started interacting with a huge wave of people online worried about the risks of greenwashing. And these risks include that we cannot just plant trees, we need emissions cuts. To which our only answer could be, this is absolutely correct, but we urgently need both. We need to restore natural ecosystems at the same time as cutting emissions. Climate change is far too big to be squabbling over solutions. We urgently need both. The next criticism was that we need to conserve the forests that we currently have. And once again, to avoid sounding repetitive, of course, this is absolutely correct. If we are to rejuvenate Earth's biodiversity, the central point in doing that, the most important cornerstone in this movement, is protecting the vital biodiversity that we still have. So of course, this is absolutely correct, and we need both. And the third major criticism, or the major challenge here, was that we don't just need forests, we need all ecosystems, grasslands and savannas among them. And once again, I repeat myself, because of course our reply was, this is absolutely correct. Our Earth system cannot work without any of the ecosystems that keep it moving. And they are all equally essential for restoring and maintaining our Earth system and our climate. And in fact, when we think of those other ecosystems and their contribution to climate, to carbon drawdown, the majority of that carbon, unlike the forests, is not stored in the above ground plant biomass. It's actually stored below ground in the soil. Because plants, as we know, absorb carbon dioxide from the atmosphere, which they use to build their structures that they need for growth. And a large proportion of this carbon enters the soil, where it feeds a huge microbial community. That is the start of the process of building topsoil. And in this soil, carbon can be stored for hundreds or even thousands of years. So to really start to quantify the full magnitude of global restoration, we started building a new generation of models, this time not based on observations from above ground, from the trees and the vegetation above ground, but from what's going on below the ground in the soil, where we went back to our networks of ecologists across the globe, who provided all the thousands and thousands and thousands of soil samples, where we could estimate the amount of carbon in each one of those samples. And once again, by pairing this information up with satellite observations and using machine learning and artificial intelligence, we could extrapolate those trends to generate predictive patterns of global soil carbon storage, revealing that the vast majority of Earth's terrestrial carbon is actually stored in the high latitude regions of the world. Those cold, high latitude regions that store the largest proportion of carbon because they are cold. And ultimately, when the conditions are cold, microbial activity is limited. The microbes in the soil are responsible for alleviating, for releasing carbon back into the atmosphere so that it can be absorbed by trees. But when cold conditions slow down that microbial activity, it leads to a huge accumulation of carbon in the soil that is now actually the home to the largest stocks of microbes and soil animals across the globe. So this initial insight already gave us an entirely new perspective of our understanding of Earth's biodiversity. It's not only that the majority of Earth's carbon is stored in the high latitude regions, but the majority of our biodiversity exists there as well, existing below our ground in the form of microbes and nematodes and protists, which are vastly abundant in these huge carbon stocks. So if we're really going to focus on protecting and preserving above ground carbon, the tropics are certainly the place to focus. But if we want to capture and protect carbon storage below ground, then managing and effectively promoting, maintaining our holistic agriculture and soils in the high latitude regions can be an absolute priority. And we could also see that these soils store about 1,500 gigatons. And by running the same models that we did on the above ground carbon, on the plants above ground, we could start to see the potential for additional carbon if we were to protect and restore ecosystems and manage agricultural systems to the best extent. And we see that there's room in the earth soil for over 100 gigatons of extra carbon if we were to protect and preserve our soils in a healthy way. And that is not just in forests. Obviously, forests are a very important part of that. So preserving and restoring forests can capture up to 30% of that 116 gigatons of carbon. But obviously, grasslands actually cover an even larger extent of the Earth's surface. And protecting those ecosystems and restoring them back to full health would capture almost 40% of the potential for carbon storage in the soil. But possibly the most effective or efficient ecosystems are the wetlands and peatlands, which, despite covering just over 5% of the Earth's surface, could capture a staggering 31% of the potential for carbon storage that exists below ground. So it's not just one ecosystem, it's not just one location, it's the protection and rebuilding of all ecosystems collectively have a huge potential to draw down some of this 300 gigatons that is lingering in our atmosphere right now. And as we restore and preserve that biodiversity, it will be maintaining and protecting the Earth system that can help us to balance and buffer climate change into the future. So really restoring and maintaining ecosystems can be such a powerful tool, not only to help us fight biodiversity loss, but also the rising atmospheric carbon dioxide concentrations. But now, of course, doing this is not just easy. It's not just about the big global numbers. Ultimately, restoration is a local challenge. And in fact, it's an incredibly difficult local challenge. At the moment, it's estimated that across the tropics, only 30% of planted and restored trees around those regions make it until survival. And that's because in many regions, they're planted in soils that are too depleted, that have a depleted microbiome that cannot support the growth of those trees. Or they're planted in ecosystems that are not ready to support those trees, or that should naturally be grasslands. Or simply it's the wrong species in the wrong region. But for many of these regions, the restoration of trees needs to be ecologically responsible with the right tree in the right soil. The responsible management of those ecosystems is critical to the success of restoration efforts. And even more challenging than the ecological challenge is often this, the social challenge. So often restoration projects or conservation projects come in and they buy up a plot of land and they exclude the local community. Not only is that socially irresponsible, but it's also not sustainable, because after that project leaves, the local community will simply come in and remove those trees for their livelihoods in many, many cases. As all of us would, we need to use those ecosystems for our livelihoods. And when restoration or conservation comes at the expense of those livelihoods, it cannot work. Restoration only works when it's done in collaboration with that local community, who can gain from all of the funding that comes towards it, but more importantly, from the ecosystem services that those ecosystems provide. Many of the projects we now work with are doing exactly this, building projects on the ground with the local community. And if you do not do that, you cannot succeed. But if you do, the benefits can be incredible. An example from the Sahel region, an area that is particularly devastated by previous land use, to the extent that vegetation really struggles to grow. And it's a highly arid region, so that trees cannot really be sustained without some human support. And that means agriculture is very difficult. But when we restore trees in the adjacent regions, these trees capture moisture, and they give stability to the soil, and they help to build up that topsoil that is absolutely critical for plant growth. And as a result, you see fertility of those regions increasing, leading to the increased agricultural yields that can then support the local communities in the long term. And there are thousands of approaches just like this, using agroforestry or holistic management of ecosystems that can empower the local communities to provide them with the ecosystems that they need to keep those healthy ecosystems going. When restoration is both socially and ecologically responsible, it has the power for immense local and social change. And so that has been the focus of all of our ongoing efforts, to essentially provide the information that can aid these local restoration projects. Because as I mentioned, we're aiming to generate this global restoration movement, but none of it happens without the people on the ground. It is built from a bottom-up movement of thousands of projects around the world who need that local ecological information to get it right. So we've been building a new technological platform that can help people anywhere, everywhere to engage in the restoration movement by providing maps, localized maps to tell everyone about the density of trees in the region, the diversity of species and the types of trees that live in every single location around the world. We even give information about the soil microbiome so that you can understand how those microbes interact with the above ground world and understand how much carbon can be stored in the soil. And ultimately, we then connect this information with the local projects that are on the ground. Thousands of projects around the world that need that localized information. And by providing that ecological insight, they can overcome several of the initial hurdles that they need for successful and responsible restoration. And they also gain the visibility to the rest of the world so that we can see them, and governments and companies around the world can see them and pledge their commitment to helping those local projects all around the world to overcome some of those social and ecological challenges. And this organization, this is the visibility. So this organization is called Restore, and we're going to be launching that in early 2021, providing 3 key services so that anyone can engage in this restoration movement. The first is those ecological insights. You can draw a picture around your area, whether it's your garden, your local community, or a huge area in the Amazonian tropics. And you can see which species of plant exist there and the benefits those species can provide to the local community. The second benefit is the monitoring, allowing projects to show what's going on the ground and track the success of those efforts over time. And that also enables us to track where investments go. If you want to donate to a restoration project, you can see that tree growing on the ground, providing the visibility and transparency that this movement desperately needs. And third, and possibly the most importantly, the sharing of ecological information so that restoration projects can learn from one another and learn from the successes and failures of past efforts, but also so that we can see them and click to donate and support those projects around the world. With this information and with this tool, we hope that everyone everywhere can get engaged in this restoration movement so that we can really start to benefit from this huge and burgeoning energy and effort around the climate change movement to support the restoration of healthy biodiversity. Oh, this shouldn't come up, but ultimately, restoration is defined as the act of returning something back to its original state. But it's also about returning it back to its original owners. The restoration of nature is for the biodiversity that exists there and the local communities that depend on it. But as that network of local projects grows, it benefits all of us. And those benefits go far beyond the threat of climate change. Even if climate change were to stop right now, the restoration and protection of Earth's biodiversity should be a top priority for all of us because it underpins all life on Earth and it supports all people that need it. And that is what brings me to the final criticism. It sounds great, but it's just naive. We'll never restore the entire globe. And this is the one criticism where I wouldn't agree. In fact, I'd say it's absolutely pointless. Because if we were to achieve even 5% of these global goals, the impacts for biodiversity, human well-being, and climate change would be astronomical. And I can guarantee that we are going to exceed those targets with the thousands of people that are already restoring and protecting ecosystems all across the globe. I just hope that the fears of people that say it can't be done don't get in the way of the incredible people that are already doing it. we do live at a very difficult time, threatened by a climate change that we've never faced before. But that also means that we live at an incredibly we have an incredibly great opportunity to make a difference and to change the system that can work for everybody to help both us and our future generations in this fight against climate change. So that's where I'd leave it. Thank you very much for listening.
Thank you so much, Thomas Crowther, for the wonderful talk. And we're going to take questions now. If anybody has questions, there are two ways they can do it. They can raise their hand down at the bottom on the participants pane, or follow the dots if you don't see participants, or you can go to chat and you can send the question directly to me and I will feed the questions in. And I'm going to start with a question that was sent by Lisa, and wants to know if population control is part of your research.
It's not part of my research, no, but of course we must anyone working on climate change or biodiversity loss or any global threat must recognize that ultimately all of this is driven by our ever-growing population. You know, the more we exploit Earth's ecosystems and the more we exploit the carbon that was previously trapped on our Earth, the more we're going to speed up these processes. So efforts to improve education and the education of people around the world to try and help in that fight against ever-rising populations are absolutely critical in the fight against climate change.
All right, they're just hands. Now this one I know is a question, because I see it's Mike Garbrino, and I know he's got a question for you.
Yeah, to what extent are you studying? Oh, can you hear me?
Yeah.
To what extent are you studying the role of invasive species and their effects on ecosystems? Because here in New York, we have a couple of very dramatic invasions. One was garlic mustard, which actually can attack native mycorrhizal fungi, which affects the health of trees. And then we have the Asian longhorn beetle, which made headlines in all the papers. So to what extent are you studying the role of these species?
That's a perfect question, because we actually, coincidentally, our next paper coming out is actually about global invasive species. So there's for a long time been this fundamental question with invasive species is what drives invasion? Why are some regions and some ecosystems vulnerable to invasion? And there's loads of theories in ecology about why certain species invade. We know that ruderal species are often more likely to invade. We know that often you have to have the traits that allow you to survive in that community. But ultimately, all of these theories come down to two main sort of ideas. One is that you have to be more similar, very, very similar to the local community in order to invade there. So if you're in like a desert, you need to have the traits that allow you to survive those harsh conditions, or that you have to be very dissimilar from the community in order to exploit a new niche and exploit some new condition. With these global data sets of trees, we can actually say the proportion of invasiveness in every single one of those dots. So in those 1.2 million locations, we can say the proportion of trees that are invaded or not invaded. And from that information, firstly, we can extrapolate those trends to see where invasiveness happens the most. And you probably are not surprised, the largest proportion of invasiveness happens on the coastal regions, and also near areas of extreme human activity. But the other thing we can do is to try and find the drivers of those invasiveness. So we can see the traits of all of those trees. And what we find is that in harsh, dry regions, you have to be very similar to the local community. And in nice, moist, optimal conditions, you have to be very dissimilar from the local community and to find a sort of a new niche. And what we find is that in the harsh conditions, the ecosystem impacts don't normally tend to be hugely drastic. Obviously, it's devastating for local biodiversity, especially when you get, really, you often see these vast monocultures developing, which can be destructive to biodiversity. But the impacts for the ecosystem are not usually that extreme. but it's in the moist, warm, optimal regions for plant growth that you see the largest impact. So those are the places where, because those species are so dissimilar, because they are so different from the surrounding community, they completely transform the ecosystem into a new sort of stable state. And because these species are often smaller, faster growing, they often have a faster carbon turnover time. And that means they usually destroy the soil carbon. As well as destroying the local biodiversity, they can really deplete the amount of carbon that's stored in the soil. And so we haven't yet got a quantification for the global impact of those invasive species. But what we do see is that in regions like the New York area, the whole eastern United States is this beautiful deciduous forest. Those are the regions where the impacts can be really, really strong for depleting soil carbon. And obviously across the tropics as well. That's even more so.
We're getting a lot of questions pouring into me, but thank you for that detailed answer there. Let's see, Potter has a question. Can we directly link emission cuts with increases in tree populations?
Not easily. Ultimately, we need to do both. Trees take up carbon dioxide from the atmosphere, and so actually they don't really hate having excess carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. So if we were to just cut emissions now, the trees would do great, but if we continued emitting, the trees would continue to do well. The reason that the trees have been depleted is because humans have depleted them. What we need to do is limit the area that we're using for agriculture by improving agricultural efficiency and move to a more holistic agricultural system, leaving more areas available for natural regeneration of trees. And in the areas that we've depleted, we can assist by planting some trees or by amending the soil so trees can grow. So it's not a direct link between stopping emissions and restoring trees. It's more the other way around. When we restore the trees, the emissions will be reduced. Sorry for that long.
Also, Potter wanted to get information on how to connect with your restoration projects in urban regions, like in Brooklyn, where Potter is. And I think someone else also wanted to know the link for your restoration project.
Restore, yes, perfect. So as I mentioned, we're currently in the phase of speaking with, I think we've got about 14,000 restoration projects, including several in the big US cities that cover a huge area of land, and we're currently in the testing phase for them to make sure that the data is working for them and that they can update their information. But in June is when we're going to launch the organization, the application, so that we can all log in and see it. And that's called Restore, and it's www.restore.eco. So restore.eco is where you will be able to find all of that information.
Okay, we'll drop that into the chat, but we'll also put it up on our Secret Science Club website so people can follow up on that. I'm going to ask Christine to unmute and ask her question.
Hi, thank you. You actually answered most of my question. I'm also from New York City and was going to ask if you could say a little bit more about particular strategies for ecological restoration in urban environments, where we obviously face a different set of challenges in terms of concentration of human activity, impervious surfaces, et cetera, but perhaps also opportunities for technological innovation and certainly concentrations of wealth.
Right. So thanks for that question, because it is really relevant. I think the consideration of urban restoration it's a really important one, because the services it provides to people can be astronomical. When we talk about carbon drawdown, urban restoration won't be the thing that draws down loads and loads of carbon, but for the shading, cooling of climate, the cleaning of the air, maintenance of the soil, for all the benefits that impact humans, the urban restoration can be possibly the most impactful and important. The impacts of trees on human well-being and human health are absolutely incredible within urban regions, and part of that is because of the what we call the urban heat island effect. So cities tend to be warmer than their surrounding area, which means that when you restore trees and they provide shading and they cool the region, they can have an immediate impact on human health. But it also means that restoring trees can be a bit more challenging in urban areas, because your climate is often, if you imagine the Earth's climate is getting warmer and warmer, those ecosystems are often 10 or 20 years further ahead of the trend, which means that you have to consider not only the species that exist in that region, but you also need to consider the species that will exist under a future climate scenario. And so this application, Restore, these models we're building are built for now, but they're also built for 2030, 2040, 2050, 2060, so that you can see when you draw a polygon or draw a picture around your park, you can see, right, this is the natural mixture of species that can survive there now. This is the species that will survive there in 10 years and 20 years. So you can start to plan for the future and restore those species that will hopefully be able to survive under a future warming climate.
Okay, I have a two-part question from Sky. One is, what percentage of a tree's mass is dead and sequesters carbon over time? And does this carbon sequestration process increase or remain constant over time? And does the living portion of a tree, which processes carbon into the soil, provide more or less carbon sequestration compared to the dead portion of a tree?
That's a lot of questions, but I like it. That's a very good question. So to start, I'll just sort of give my simplest analogy for how carbon storage in trees happens. I think a lot of people do ask, when trees die or when they respire, are they just losing the carbon back out and then there's no net gain? But I think as the question was suggesting, there is a huge net gain, because you sort of, I like to imagine it as like a bank account. At the beginning, you're putting in more money than you're taking out. So the tree's taking up more carbon than it's growing out. And the largest proportion of that tree is the living growing biomass. And it's taking up lots of carbon and it's respiring a smaller proportion. But over time, as that forest grows, over time, the sort of curve of uptake relative to release slowly plateaus off. And by about 100 or 150 or 200 years, you'll probably be having as much input as release. There'll be as much carbon coming into that forest as there is being released from that forest through the respiration of soil or through the restoration of the trees or from the death of those trees. But once you've reached that steady state, once you've got balanced inputs and outputs, that's the point when, sure, you're not gaining more carbon, but you've got this huge bank account of carbon stored right there. So, and that's the point we're wanting to get to. So at the beginning, the proportion of the tree that is contributing the most is the living part of the tree. By the end, the majority of the carbon storage is actually in the dead part of the tree and in the soil below the ground.
Okay, great. We're going to try another live one here with Susan Hamovich.
Oh, hi, that's me. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
I was just typing my question, which I'm glad I did, because I know I would stumble over it otherwise. It's just really exciting to feel optimism. I just have to say that. I tend towards the pessimistic. But my question is this: the economy and diet of the North, that is the more developed countries, depends on the exploitation of the land and people of the South, usually involving huge amounts of monoculture farming, and lately the decimation of forest and jungle for grazing cattle. Will your project or other efforts address this economic kind of destructive interdependency?
Thanks so much for the question. It's a very good point, and it is true that ultimately, in the long term, we are going to need societal change. Massive systemic change. We cannot support an ever-growing population that continues to feed on meat or use in massive monoculture crop systems, the industrial-sized crop systems. So absolutely, we're going to need the improvement of the agricultural system, and I think there's two ways in which that'll happen. One is through the improvement in technology, and we're already seeing huge improvements of efficiency. I work very closely with an organization called Bula, who they produce the machinery that is used for about 1/3 of the world's agriculture. So all your combine harvesters and I don't know what else to press and squash and pulp agricultural produce. And their goal by 2050 is to halve the land area required by industrial scale food production at the same time as doubling the yield. And they believe they can achieve that through improvements in technology. So that's one. I think they're very, 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 very optimistic, but either way, that would be incredible. The other one is a move towards more local, small scale, holistic agriculture, as I'm sure we're all aware. Now, you mentioned, I guess the real point of your question is are we going to help address some of this economic injustice? And I think the goal is to empower the local communities so that they can both gain from the funding that the richer, wealthier countries want to invest in restoration, but also they can benefit from the sustainable maintenance of those ecosystems in the long run. So in that respect, yes, we'd hope to see a flow of funding and support moving in that direction. Whether that will, how that will impact the entire economic system, we sort of extends probably beyond my vision, but that would absolutely. But everything you mentioned there is central to this movement becoming sustainable.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Okay, now we have a question here that actually there's two that are kind of related from Carol and Lauren. One is, what's the impact of wildfires in the Western US on carbon emissions? What might the long-term climate impact be in our atmosphere? And then Lauren asks, what about carbon capture by ocean plants? I'm kind of smushing those together for you.
So the fires one is, important to remember, fires are a natural part of the system, and particularly in very dry and arid regions, regular fires do, they're a part of the successional stage of many of these plants, and they're important for maintaining biodiversity. Now, it is true, we are seeing a huge spike in the wildfires, clearly, and that does seem to be associated. We know that we see increased prevalence of fire in association with warming and drying conditions. So it is possible that it's connected to climate change. And if that is the case, the extent and severity of them does seem like it's going to drive some level of feedback to the climate system. So more fires, more carbon is being emitted into the atmosphere, driving faster climate change, leading to more fires. And it's one of many ecological feedbacks that seem to be speeding up the rate of climate change at the moment. And we work on several others, like increased soil carbon losses from warming, respiring soils, that can also speed up the rate of climate change. So it is a very concerning thing. Now, that's not to say that the link between the extreme fires that we've seen in the last couple of years and climate change is completely nailed on. It's very difficult to really get a causal link there, but it seems like it could be. The other question about ocean capture, that's also a very interesting question. We work a lot on oceans as well, and carbon storage in the oceans. There is a lot. The oceans store vastly more carbon than the land, but in the ocean, it's not normally something that we want to promote. We don't really want more carbon being dissolved into the ocean, because that leads to ocean acidification, which is killing coral reefs around the world. And it's, in fact, they're probably the first ecosystem that we're going to see completely lost from the planet. With rising atmospheric carbon concentrations leads to rising ocean concentrations. But I think the question was specifically about plants. Now, there are some people manipulating phytoplankton in the ocean, which might have potential for increased carbon capture. I've not seen huge evidence for mass increases in phytoplankton, and I'm not quite sure of the ecological consequences of those. You can see blooms leading to slight eutrophication in systems, but I believe that it's possibly a very viable option. The other one is things like seaweed or blue carbon, where people will restore coastal regions, and that's one where I would say it's more along the benefits of urban reforestation. So the coastal region restoration won't have huge impacts for carbon storage, because it's very small region, small area, but the impacts it can have on both terrestrial and aquatic biodiversity are incredible. Mangroves, when you restore a mangrove region, it protects the entire region from degradation, from rising sea levels, from all sorts of things. Biodiversity can be protected in a huge way. So the rest, so blue carbon can be incredibly valuable for all of those things.
Okay, Alice, I believe I had the question about speaking to the pros and cons of logging versus leaving forests forever wild, which is something that also came up in the politics here in the States.
Right. So it's always hard to, there's trade-offs in every land management decision. You know, we would classify the restoration of biodiversity as fitting under any of the, anything from a sort of holistic agriculture or agroforestry system, all the way to, you know, selective logging and management of, sustainable management of that forest, where you can remove individual logs to promote you can actually speed up the succession of that forest, leading to more carbon storage, and you get your timber out of it. And all the way on the other end of the spectrum, where you just leave it alone and let it go. What I personally don't promote any one over any other, because, you know, timber and logging is necessary for some communities somewhere. Agroforestry is necessary for food production in many regions around the world. And at the same time, I desperately would love to see a huge proportion of the Earth's nature preserved in its natural state, because that's when we see the greatest impacts for biodiversity. So that, I think that ultimately the point comes down to what I mentioned in the talk. It's not a global challenge, it's a local challenge. And so what we want to do is enable all the people in all the regions to make their most informed decisions, to be ecologically responsible in whatever sustainable land management practice they have.
There are a couple of hands, but I'm going to get this. These two people have asked a similar question. When it comes to including local communities in these efforts, especially non-Western peoples, do you have any examples of local communities' approaches, e.g. TEK, etc., being actually integrated into models and actual approaches, rather than only engaging them with activities and instruction coming from dominant society scientific perspectives on conservation? And then another person also asked if there are successful models of collaboration with local communities, and are you working with any international organizations?
So that is a very good question, because a lot of times, yeah, the sort of local engagement does just mean, you know, some NGO or some scientist coming in and saying, oh, let's try that. Oh no, it didn't work, screw it, or we leave. Or it's not fully integrated within the local community. So it's not a sustainable practice. It's sort of something that's, someone got a grant for a few $100,000 and it sustained their project for a couple of years, and then they go away and it's gone. And it's actually often has more damaging impacts than positive. But there are thousands of examples of it working very well. And I think I guess I'll name a couple of organizations. There's One Tree Planted is one that works with, I don't know how many hundreds of communities around the world. And each time they do so they're focusing on the ecosystem services. So for example, there's one project in West Africa where they they encourage people to restore trees so that they can put honey so they can have beehives hanging from the trees, which protects them from honey badgers, which actually has a huge economic benefit, and that's why it became sustainable. There's another one called Eden Reforestation, which doesn't necessarily work specifically on the ecosystem services that are provided, but it works on the idea of the sustainable this sort of sustainable model where they bring in funding for you to restore, for a community to restore trees, but that funding is split evenly across time so that you get the same amount of funding the next year to maintain the tree and the same amount of funding the year after to maintain the tree. And so you would lose that funding once it's gone, because there are loads of times where people get paid to plant a load of trees and they go, right, funding's gone, I'll cut them down, now you have to pay me to plant them again. And it's chaos. And the third organization I'll mention is one that many of you might know. It's Ecosia. So it's actually a search engine similar to Google. And they say, you know, the thing is, every time you do an Ecosia search, they plant a tree. Now they are working with a huge network of organizations, and they have an incredibly good success rate with the organizations they work with, because they do provide some funding, but almost every time they work with the organizations that are not the organizations, sorry, they're working with the community leaders who essentially they approach to say, what do you want to happen here? And when the community leaders are driving it, that's when you get the engagement from the wider community and often the sustainable movement. And that's the example that I gave in the talk, where they restored trees in that, I can't quite remember where it was in the Sahel region. You restore trees and it improves agricultural yields in the neighboring area. So in this project, they were specifically buying up half of the land, planting trees on half of it, and then you see these incredible booms in agricultural yields in the neighboring areas that are really good for long-term sustainable restoration. So there's lots of models that work.
That's good news. I'm going to take one of these live questions from 751-673. If you're there, 751, you can unmute yourself.
Okay. The question is related to the presentation of the amount of carbon in the upper atmosphere. I believe you showed that it varies with the season. However, the world, the northern hemisphere has one season and the southern hemisphere has another season. So shouldn't it equalize it so that you wouldn't see the difference between them? Because we overall we share the same upper atmosphere.
I think what you're saying is, as seasons go from, as the northern hemisphere is in summer to the southern hemisphere being in summer, you'll see more carbon dioxide in the northern hemisphere in winter, and then more carbon dioxide in the southern hemisphere in their winter, and it'll constantly change. The reason that the changes are much more stark in the northern hemisphere is because there's more land mass, and that means there's more plants exchanging a huge amount of carbon. So you do see the fluctuations slightly higher in the northern hemisphere, but you're right, we are all sharing one climate, and increases in CO2 in our atmosphere impact the temperature of the planet in different ways, but it's impacting all of us. So certainly, all of atmospheric carbon dioxide concentrations impact the entire globe. I'm not sure if I really nailed that answer, but.
Okay, we have so many questions, and I'm not sure how much time you have for us, but I'm going to try to. Tell me when you're going to have to wind down.
I might have to go after about 8 minutes or so.
Okay, I will look on the clock, and then here's just a kind of basic one from Sarah. Who collects all the data required to make those interactive maps?
So that's a great question. It's actually ecologists all over the world. So we started by contacting anyone that's ever published a paper on tree density. And so we contacted loads and loads and loads of those people. Then we started contacting NGOs, and they have lots of things. We also, bizarrely, have logging companies. They have really good inventories of their regions, but probably the largest amount of data comes from national forest inventories. And actually the US has probably the world's best national forest inventory. It's an incredible resource that has cost loads and loads of people. It's an expensive resource, but it's been absolutely central to the building of these global models. So it's amazing that exists.
I'm going to bring in another live one. Stuart. Are you there, Stuart? Maybe not.
Yes, I am. Hi, thank you for taking my question. Is there any type of planting that can assist in holding the CO2 in the soil in the tundra region as that area warms up?
That's a very good question. Yes, so the tundra is a difficult one. So as I mentioned in the talk, the majority of the soil carbon is stored in the tundra. And the concern is, as I think Stuart is pointing to, is that warming conditions are speeding up carbon losses from the soil into the atmosphere in the tundra regions, which is actually causing a really strong positive feedback, which is accelerating climate change. Now, the question about how we manage that is really difficult because, firstly, these aren't areas that are hugely impacted by human activity in general. For the places that are, definitely cover crops and reduced tilling are the best approaches. So making sure some vegetation is on the soil and making sure that there's limited soil disturbance is absolutely central. But the majority of the places are not disturbed. This is a very high latitude regions where there's a limited amount of human activity. And in fact, in this case, I would suggest that tree restoration is not really ideal there, because tundra is defined as a cold ecosystem that doesn't support trees. And so we don't want to be putting trees into the tundra. You know, trees are already encroaching further and further north into the cold regions. But there might be ideas, and there are some people talking about peatland restoration and literally managing and managing mosses. So sphagnum mosses can maintain wetlands that can store huge amounts of carbon. Shrublands in those regions can be maintained and managed to some extent, but really restoration in those regions is one of the biggest conundrums. We want to figure out what do we do in those areas to try and trap that carbon in the soil. It's a really big challenge.
Susie is asking, to what degree has COVID-related behavior change made a measurable change in our climate change trajectory, if any?
Very good question. We do see a very clear that, you know, the acceleration of elevated CO2 has had a bigger dip down this year than most years. So certainly there's been an immediate and obvious impact in our emissions. The question is what will the long-term impact of that be? Will ecosystems flourish a little bit more, helping to stabilize the system a little bit? I think it's very unlikely. I'd like to be optimistic about it. And I think what COVID shows us is just how we, albeit it's been a brutally hard time, that society can, to some degree, function whilst we reduce our impact on ecosystems. And so if we can take that from this process, then that would be amazing, because of course emissions have gone down. Yeah, the long-term impacts though, it's too early to say, obviously.
Yeah. Are there any specific species of trees that absorb more CO2? Or
Now,
what type of native tree should I select to plant? And do they support reductions in methane level?
that is a question that I tend to avoid answering because every location has a different tree or mixture of trees that exist. What I would say is choosing one is never the answer. It's almost never the case that one tree will be the answer. Usually, we ran a model. We published it, I think, 2 years ago in the journal Science, showing that in every single location across the globe, a mixture of tree species is always better for storing more carbon and more diversity than one fast-growing tree. I think there's a huge tendency for us to say, great, where do I live? What's the fastest growing tree here? Brilliant, let's do that. And then suddenly, as quick as you can, there's a monoculture that has destroyed biodiversity even more. And it's also not very sustainable because a disease or a beetle or something could come through there, and if it affects that one tree, it'll affect all of them. It's always better to restore a native mixture of species. And so that's what this platform Restore will hopefully allow you to do. So you'll see, right, in my garden or in my region, there's normally 14 tree species, and here's the list, and I can choose which mixture I go. And I think that's usually the approach. So it's getting mixtures of species. Okay,
so I think we've kind of run almost into your 8 minutes, but I'll just say that there's so many questions and really good ones. We could almost have you back just to do questions sometime. But quite a few of them are asking about if the Restore project has mechanism to allow local organizations to collaborate, or just sort of more local connecting into global things.
Yeah, I mean, honestly, that is these questions have, by the way, been amazing. I'm delighted, but that final one is a very good one for me to leave on, because the point of Restore is not so scientists tell local people stuff. It's probably the other way around. It's so that we can say, look, here's all the information we have. It's going to be right in some places, it's going to be wrong in some places. But what we need is for the local people to be leading that. So they will draw their areas, they will say what's happening in those areas, they will upload data to show what's going on in those regions, and they'll also automatically be connected with all of the other projects that are happening in a similar environment. And actually, when we speak to our stakeholders, that seems to be the function that they're most interested in, so that a project in one ecosystem type, maybe they've got some invasive species that's really a nightmare to get rid of or deal with, they can immediately have like a forum where they can speak to all of the other projects in a similar environment type that might have already overcome those challenges. And so I think that knowledge sharing between each other is going to be huge, and the knowledge sharing back to us, I think, is going to be even more valuable, because then we adjust the global models that help everyone else, so that it's very much a two-way flow of information. And I'll mention just because it's happening. So in March next year, there'll be a film coming out on Netflix called, I think it's called, what is it called? The Devil's Breath. And it's about the increased prevalence of fires and how local restoration can actually help in those, in the regulation of Earth's climate, both locally and globally. And that really goes into detail about how the sharing of that information can form a network that has that global impact.
That's wonderful. Maybe we can have you come back sometime around then and talk a little more and answer some more questions. Thomas Crowther, thank you so much. It was a wonderful talk and great answers. And I apologize to all the wonderful questions that we didn't get to, but I will say again, it's your website is www.restor.eco, restore without the E, .eco. We'll put all this on our Secret Science Club website and also a link to your lab. And
perfect. Yeah, I was going to say, for now, you can get all the information from the lab website. So the
lab website. Okay, so we'll include that information on our Secret Science Club. And it's been a thrill to have you. Congratulations on all the wonderful work, and keep on doing.